Shalom, friends. After having seen the missionary discourse of Jesus, we are going to see the implication of that mission. Chapters 11 and 12 will give us a narrative illustrating the authority claimed by Jesus and the rejection of Jesus by his own people. In fact, the theme of rejection of Jesus as the Messiah by his own people will be broached in the coming chapters, and it will go on till the end of the Gospel according to Matthew. There is going to be a struggle between belief and unbelief that will decrease the number of the miracle stories. There is going to be a line drawn up between the disciples and the enemies of Jesus, and that will become harder. And there's going to be a series of questions, attacks, counterattacks, and dispute narratives in the coming chapters. In the first part of this chapter 11, we will see Jesus answering a question by John the Baptist. The chapter begins with John the Baptist found in the prison at Machaerus, a prison built by Herod the Great 5 miles east of the Dead Sea. John heard about the messianic preaching and the teaching and the miracle works of Jesus, and the activity of Jesus in a way went against the conception that John had regarding the Messiah. In fact, John preached about a God who is a stringent judge, and his judgment would be fierce. Instead, here is Jesus, who through his preaching, teaching, and acts of mercy and compassion and healing brings comfort and solace to the sinners and outcasts. So there is a kind of a crisis of faith, and that's the reason why John sends his disciples to Jesus to find out if he is the Messiah that he foretold, or he has to wait for another. Jesus does not give a yes or no answer. Instead, let us hear verse 5. Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive the sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And this is actually the summary of the healing miracle ministry that we found in chapter 8 and 9. And the last part, the preaching to the poor, is the summary of the teaching that we found in chapter 5 to 7. So, without explaining, Jesus is giving a positive answer. And again, Jesus tells John not to be scandalized by his perceptions about the Messiah. And this is an indication for the reader or a listener, because Jesus is going to be a stumbling block because of the teachings of Jesus. In the next session, we find Jesus highlighting the importance of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a crowd puller, but he was not a crowd pleaser. He was in prison, in fact, precisely because he denounced the illegal marriage of Herod. So he was not found in the palace of Herod. He was found in the prison built by Herod. And his clothing was that of a camel's hair, and he wore a leather belt. So John was not simply a prophet. He was more than a prophet, probably as foretold in the book of Deuteronomy. Those who live in the desert and those who are away from the luxuries and comforts of life are not cowards. Neither are they showy people. They cannot be swayed away by public opinion. We come to the next session where Jesus has a complaint against the present generation using the parable of the children in the market. The inconsistent and self-satisfied people have refused salvation brought by or preached by both John and Jesus. In fact, Jesus made a statement about John. Among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. So John was a great ascetic. Jesus was very expansive. The asceticism of John challenged the people, but they said, you have a demon. Jesus' easy and free table fellowship with religious outcasts made his enemies accuse him as glutton, drunkard, and friend of sinners and outcasts. So both John and Jesus were denounced by his enemies. But Jesus at the end of the session says, both John and Jesus will be vindicated, will be proved right by wisdom. In the third part, we find a growing opposition against Jesus and rejection by him, especially by his own people in the cities. From verse 20 onwards, the Galilean cities where he performed miracles are mentioned there. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Chorazin is nearly 5 miles close to his own town, Capernaum, while Bethsaida is towards the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. And he denounces even Capernaum. The chapter 9 began by saying, Jesus, came to his own town. Capernaum is a privileged city, and it was blessed by the presence of Jesus. He chose Capernaum as his own place of ministry. Now, Jesus is unpleasantly surprised by the lack of faith of people who had witnessed to all the miracle stories that we narrated in chapter 8 and 9. And the acceptance by the Gentile people is an indication of the acceptance of the good news of Jesus by the non-Jewish people. It will find till the end of the gospel. The good news will be rejected by his own people, and the good news will be accepted by the Gentiles. And finally, from verse 25 to 30, Jesus speaks about divine revelation and the human response. Let me tell you, this is the heart, verse 25 to 30, is the heart of chapter 11 and 12. Because the first part of chapter 11, we saw the rejection of Jesus by his own people and his own cities, his own towns. And chapter 12, rejection by the religious authorities. So in this section, there is the praise of the Father for the revelation that God gave. There is the identity of Jesus and the context of revelation and the invitation of Jesus. Please note of the two verbs used, hide and reveal. There's a sharp contrast between the wise and the intellectual and the babes. So God reveals to the babes represented by the marginalized, the poor, the sinners, the Gentiles. But God hides from the intellectuals and highly sophisticated people. There is a close relationship between the Father and the Son. See, just in verse 25 and 27, we find 5 times the use of the word Father. In fact, Jesus begins by saying, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, which is a Jewish title. But after that, my Father, the Father, they are all special relationship that Jesus has with the Father, Abba. And this revelation is given by God to the simple, unlearned, and the illiterate. But they are open to God's word. While the religiously educated people, they are closed. They don't want to accept Jesus. And Jesus has this power to communicate to whomever He wishes. So the Father hides or reveals this message. And Jesus says, come to me. Verse 28, I think it would be better to learn by heart. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burden. I will give you rest. Those who are laboring, those who are heavy laden, are those who find the law of the scribes and Pharisees unbearable, the people of the land. But Jesus' law, the yoke that is given in the gospel, represents the law of Jesus that are not written down. They are not precepts to be followed, but the person of Jesus. And so, following Jesus is not to study the law, but to study Jesus, His way of behavior, His gentleness, and His obedience to the Father. So, accepting Jesus is accepting the yoke of Jesus, which is His own person, His gentleness and His obedience to the Father. Amen. Shalom.